Thanks, Larry. I guess I'd like to think that science is beginning to grow up. It's probably for most of the history of science, it's been about taking things apart and trying to understand the pieces of things and trying to do things in a way that's separate from nature. But it seems like one of the things that we've been learning more and more about with science is that science is really a lot about the relationships among organisms, the relationships between people and the environment, the relationships between lakes and permafrost and rivers and the ocean. It's all about relationships, and that's what we've been hearing here today. It's not just science that knows this, but I think this is becoming really clear to science now, that if we want to understand what's happening in the world, we need to think very carefully about the relationships, and especially about those relationships that, that people have a role in. Another thing that makes me optimistic about science is that I think it's beginning to listen more rather than just talk about things. So I think we have a huge amount to learn from the elders here in Alaska. Not only in terms of the values that they can teach us, but also just the observations, things that people have seen as they've been out on the land and the water for a long time. So my sense is that a lot of what we know about climate change, some of the most convincing evidence that I've heard about climate change comes from things that hunters and elders have told me. So I think being able to listen and listen respectfully to people who have a lot more experience on the land and on the sea is going to help science a lot in terms of understanding the things that are happening. I think also listening to the values that the faith community has to tell us, and also that indigenous people have to tell us, is another really important thing. I think many of the people that are interested and concerned about climate change and doing the science of climate change are doing it because of values they hold and because they think that knowing something more about that will be useful to people, not as a way of controlling climate, but as a way of repairing some of the things that we've been doing inadvertently as we think about doing other things. So I think science is growing up a bit in the sense that it is beginning to listen more. It's beginning to recognize more about the relationships among organisms, among things, and especially the important, the essential integrity of people as part of the rest of the world. And understanding that people are part of the rest of the world means not only that we have a huge influence on everything that goes on in the world, but it also means that all of the things that we do and that have an effect on the rest of the world comes back and influences us too. So even if we think about this selfishly and only care about the human species, we have a lot to gain by being very careful and caring for Mother Earth. Because only by thinking very carefully about our relationship to the rest of the planet are we going to have the sort of life that we want our children and grandchildren to have. So what can we do, those of us that are in Alaska? First of all, I think of all of us as being scientists in one way or another. One of the things that several people have pointed out here is that we see a lot of things changing in Alaska. And as Larry mentioned, this is something that that's much more obvious to those of us that live here than it is to most people in the rest of the world. So one of the things I think we can do is be more active in telling this story. We can tell people that we know in other places. Now that there's things like Facebook and Twitter and things like that, we can tell people anywhere in the world about the way in which climate is changing. And probably that's the least important thing, the fact that climate is changing. What's more important is that it's changing people's lives. It's changing lives of other organisms. It's changing the relationships of everything that goes on the planet. And this is something that we can see in Alaska because it's all around us. And it's a chance for us to do something that's much broader than just what goes on in Alaska. We can tell that story elsewhere in the world. Another thing that's interesting about science that I only learned about in the last year or so is that the way in which we tell things to other people has a very strong effect on the way other people choose to act. So, for example, and this is one place where I think the scientific community has done a very bad job. If we tell people about a story of gloom and doom and how everything is terrible, and everything's going to hell in a handbasket, then people tend to look inwardly. They tend to think about themselves. They tend to disengage from other people. As they think about themselves, they think about meeting their immediate needs rather than thinking about the broader needs of society or the capacity of the planet to meet the needs of future generations. So the way in which we, as scientists, have talked about the problems of climate change, I think, have in many ways contributed to the way in which people tend to focus on themselves, tend to focus on consuming, rather than focusing on relationships and focusing on other things that they can do. But I think that probably has a lot to do with the way in which we talk about things in general, not just about climate change or about science, but we often tend to focus on the problems, and I think it's time that we focus on the solutions. And there's a lot of solutions that are out there. One of the flip sides of being in a crisis situation is that there's lots of things that we can do to make things better. And I think another thing that the science of climate change tells us is that these very large global scale problems are, for the most part, the aggregate result of very small actions that each one of us takes every day. So if we think about the actions that each one of us take in a small way every day, it's the addition of each of those actions that creates the large problems that we face as a society. And so I think there's lots of things that we can do individually and as a community of people living in a place that can really make a difference. And another thing that I think motivates many of us to want to do these things is that we care about the place where we live, or we care about many places in one way or another. And we can make those places a better place through the actions that we take, through the things that we do as a community in those places. So I think all of these things that I've mentioned, these are a lesson that you can tell by looking at scientific details. It's also a lesson that we learn from our elders in Alaska. It's also a lesson that we learn from communities of faith in Alaska and elsewhere. So I think we have a common story to tell and a very common set of lessons to learn, and perhaps more important than either of those, a lot of common opportunities that by working together we can do a lot to make the world a better place. Thank you.